If those of you in the back by the posters could come on forward, we will start the program in just a few moments. Well, I would like to welcome everyone to this fall's presidential lecture. This lecture series was started about 4 years ago as a way to showcase to the broader university community and to the general public the incredible talent of our faculty here at Iowa State University. We've had several very inspiring lectures from faculty members all across the campus, from psychology to animal science to food science and human nutrition to engineering. And we have a great lecture tonight from landscape architecture. I want to thank the F. Wendell Miller Endowment for support of this lecture series, and the government of the student body for their support of the University Lectures program. And I'd now like to ask Interim Provost Susan Carlson to come forward to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, President Joffrey. It's my particular pleasure to introduce the speaker for the Fall Presidential University Lecture because Professor Mira Engler and I have been friends and neighbors for many years. Indeed, we met on the first day she arrived in Ames, having just completed her graduate studies at UC Berkeley. Now, you can read about her on this lovely handout, but I'm going to tell my own story about Mira. Now a professor of landscape architecture, Mira Engler is the author of many articles on public art and neglected landscapes. Her recent book from Johns Hopkins University Press is entitled Designing America's Waste Landscapes. Professor Engler has won international acclaim for her work as a designer. Her otherworldly garden was included among a handful of designs in the prestigious Westonbirt Festival of the Garden in the United Kingdom. Her designs have been regularly displayed in her native Israel, where she has also often worked as a designer. Her posters, plans, and presentations have been featured in exhibitions from New Mexico to New Zealand, from Harvard to Ames. Her scholarly and creative acclaim have accompanied a remarkably productive career as a teacher, mentor, and colleague on the faculty of Iowa State's Department of Landscape Architecture, where she has been since 1989. She was the recipient of the College of Design's Award for Extraordinary Performance in 2001, and she continues to press her own boundaries by pursuing a PhD in architecture and urban design from the University of California at Los Angeles. She didn't need to do that. She's already a full professor. There is, however, no space on the traditional CV to list the fact that Professor Engler is a visionary. This vision has allowed her to see beauty and usefulness where others only see refuse, landfill, and waste. This vision has allowed her to see beauty and usefulness where she has indeed a particular talent for uncovering the metaphoric potential of what others throw away and neglect. Nor does she stop with imagining what could be done with what we have abandoned. As a landscape architect, she has worked tirelessly to rehabilitate wastelands that even T.S. Eliot would accept as dim, dreary, and disposable. And yet Eliot, himself a scholar, artist, and working professional, even Eliot would agree that it takes more than professional knowledge and practical experience to breed lilacs out of the barren land. It takes the talent and vision that has distinguished Mira Engler's entire career. And so, on behalf of President Gregory Joffrey and the faculty of Iowa State University, it is a special pleasure to invite Professor Engler to share her unique vision with us tonight. Her lecture is entitled Critical Landscapes, From Pork Barrels to Otherworldly Dumps and Gardens. Professor Engler.
Can you all hear me? I have my own little clip here, which will allow me to be a little bit more free. As we wait for the screen to show, first of all, thank you very much, Susan, for this introduction. I remember that night that I arrived at Gina Krendel's home, and I couldn't find, it was 2 a.m., and I was swinging. A policeman actually stopped me in Boone in the intersection because I didn't stop there, and he was sure I was drunk. I was driving. I couldn't stop for a motel because I ran out of money. I was driving for 10 days, and arrived to Ames finally at 2 a.m. looking for the key, and I'm not sure if I rang your bell to go into the house, but that was an amazing night. So thank you for this introduction, wonderful introduction. I'm extremely honored to have been invited by the president of our university, Dr. Martin Jewski. I'm most humbled to stand on the same podium where great speakers have stood before me today, and those that I admired. I'm flattered to speak to such great, honorable audience. The interim provost, Susan Carlson, the landscape architecture department chair, Tim Keller, and sort of looking around, really in general, to all of my colleagues, to my students, to my friends that have come here, to the General University and the general public. And I would like also to send my greetings from here and my wishes for a fast recovery to our College of Design Dean, Mark Engelbrecht, who cannot be here tonight, but I'm sure would have loved to. My presentation will provide a small window into a broad discipline and profession of landscape architecture. However, I should emphasize that my practice represents but one of many modes of landscape architecture practice. My talk was originally titled Critical Landscape from Pork Barrel to Otherworldly Dumps and Gardens. Meanwhile, as you can see, I took the liberty and reversed the order of the project, beginning with the magical realm of gardens and ending up in the more prosaic pork barrels. Let's see if it's going to work. The lecture forms a collage of my built-in theoretical works of the past 10 years. It tells 5 simple stories about the complex relationships we have with the places in which we live, work, and play. It highlights the ways in which professionals like myself may intervene. And unless otherwise indicated, all the drawings and the photographs you'll see here are mine. Now I'd like to make one small confession. When I was called and asked and agreed to do this lecture, I called my longtime neighbor and friend and colleague, Susan Carlson, and asked her what she thinks the broad public would like to know about landscape architecture. And Susan told me, I think, that they would like to know that landscape architecture is not just about moving dirt, planting flowers. It is an intellectual field. And of course, it sounded so well put that I since then borrowed it and maybe stole it. So now it's the time to credit you for this particular statement, which actually opens up my lecture. So, again, landscape architecture is not just about moving dirt and planting flowers. It is an intellectual field and a critical practice that grounds the lives of people and other species in place. What does it mean to be critical in landscape architecture? In critical landscape practice, designers are critics, and design is in itself a mode of criticism. Here there's some. This is still. Okay.
Can you hand it to me? Pull it out.
Wait.
Yeah. 1 minute. Go ahead and talk.
All right. I think it's better. Good. All right. All human space, especially public space, is infused with intentions and activity, memory and conflict, politics and ideology. Critical design interrogates the multiple dimensions of space, be they social, political, ecological, physical, intellectual, or aesthetic. Critical design is concerned with issues that go beyond why a place is shaped the way it is and how it functions. Critical design also asks, what is the message behind the form or space? Whose aesthetics are used? Who is included in this place? Who is excluded? Who will benefit from it? What did we give up to make this place? And ultimately, critical design guides and creates the potential for more productive, equitable, healthy, and enjoyable experiences. My work spans across landscapes of polar opposites. On the one hand, gardens, and on the other, dumps. As diverse as my work may seem, it is always site-specific, directly responsive to locality and context. It resists the flattening effects of the commodity markets. Underlying all my work is an effort to recover, recycle, and sustain cultural memories, tradition, and everyday practices found in place, as well as search for and apply new expressions and functions as needed. Now, in order to ease our introduction to dumps, I begin with the familiar territory of landscape architecture with a fantastical garden project. Story number 1, the otherworldly garden. At the conceptual nucleus of every garden lies paradise, a utopian landscape of nothing but simplicity, abundance, and pleasure. Every garden, be it as small as a square foot flower bed or as big as a national park, encompasses the idea of and the longing for the Garden of Eden. Gardens offer a temporary respite, an escape, and at the same time they tell us how much our everyday world is imperfect and complicated. My otherworld garden was built in Western England at the Westonbirt International Garden Festival in 2004. It was selected among 19 other gardens, or with 19 other gardens, in an international competition and installed for the duration of the summer festival. My collaborator was a metal artist from Bristol, John Pecker, who helped me design and construct the sculptures. Garden festivals are a unique venue for experimentation in garden art, a temporary garden exhibit for garden lovers, and an entertainment ground for the general public. They're becoming increasingly popular throughout the world. Now, the Otherworld Garden was in part inspired by the garden at the Villa Orsini in Bomarzo, Italy, or as it is known today, the Bosco dei Monstri, the Grove of the Monsters. This late Renaissance garden, arguably the most eccentric garden of the time, is filled with mystery and riddles, ambiguities and symbolism, wonder and exaggeration, precariousness and love. Sculpted from the mother rock of a forested hillside, just across the valley from the city and its towering palace, the sculptures seem to rise from the earth to be planted in the landscape. This garden was abandoned in the 18th century. It became overgrown and was forgotten. Centuries later, the famed surrealist artist Salvador Dali discovered the garden and shot a movie there. Since then, interest in the garden was revived. Like in Bomarzo, the Otherworld Garden builds on the existing context and is embedded in the regional myth, traditions, symbolism, language, and material. It is set within the famous Arboretum, the Westonbirt Arboretum, in the Cotswold region, a region where picturesque rolling meadows are crisscrossed by stone fences exquisitely built in dry stone technique. The region is also dotted by ancient Celtic relics of burial mounds and stone constellation, such as the ritual circles of Avebury. The dark and majestic tree grove at the site of my garden, the dry stone walls of the region, and the Celtic relics of the region have each inspired the primary forms and spirit of my garden. The Celtics, which recognize the spiritual connections of people to nature and construed as the 20 main letters of their Ogham sign language for the names of 20 sacred trees, seemed well fitted for a garden set within an arboretum. A triple-sided spiral made of gabion matrices connects the clearing with the forest, inviting people to make a journey into the dark thicket. Local limestone contained in sculpted gabions animate the forest. Now, while the standard gabions, boxed gabions, we know, are mostly used by engineers to retain steep slopes, the gabions in the Otherworld Gardens are shaped into giant, enigmatic figures: green men, warrior helmet, Cernunnos mask. This is the guardian of hunters and animals. Oops, sorry. and of course the ram-headed serpent. Partially buried in the ground, the sculptural gabions seem to rise from the land and emerge from the trees. A galen, which is an erect stone found in the region, and inscribed with the ancient Ogham language of symbols, is placed at the corner of the garden and carved with a passage called the Battle of the Trees from the Book of Taliesin, the last Celtic shaman. The passage describes a forest transformed into a hostile army to fend off evil spirits. Other stones placed near existing trees are carved with Ogham letters that represent the corresponding tree name in Latin and English. Much like in Parco di Monstri in Bomarzo, visitors enter the garden, the world of wonder and imagination, reconnecting with the lore and magic of place, and eventually claiming their garden for their own play, picture-taking, and improvisation. Here you can see people are also able to pick up loose stones from cauldrons, open cauldrons, stamp them with the Ogham letters, and then voluntarily they choose to place them on the trees, sometimes corresponding with the names of the letters that are stamped on the stones. At one point, there was a storytelling event at night, and the sculptures were lighted. And of course, among the stories that were told this night was the Battle of the Trees from the Book of Taliesin. Gardens are the playgrounds of landscape architects. Here is where we let loose of our fantasies, recreate a version of paradise, have fun, and invite others to join the party. But when we leap off the garden wall and land in reality, play is replaced with work and often hard battles. And here is where story number 2 begins. Rural reliquaries. Here, my work takes on the role of a guardian, a recycler, and a critique. Here I champion what I call the creative protection of places under the threat of extinction. I've especially come to the rescue of sites which carry a stigma, places inflicted with abandonment and waste. Such spaces remain defiant to the tight embrace of codes of order, aesthetics, real estate value, and consumer market. These spaces are strategically positioned to haunt and intimidate, fascinate, and inspire us at once. Whether rural or urban, these sites of anti-aesthetics and anti-convention, or if you will, sites of provocation, play an important role in preserving ecological and cultural diversity and cultural memory. I'm not a preservationist, but rather an opportunist. I seek productive continuity of places, and believe that change must be built on physical deposits of present and past, and that spatial oddities and provocations are essential for the vitality of the city and the countryside. Decaying farms, trying in vain to fend off the development pressure of a rapidly changing rural landscape, triggered my curiosity soon after I arrived in Iowa. The protection of decaying farm was my prerogative in a 1996 proposal to save some for the benefits of the public. The proposal, titled Rural Reliquaries, won an award in the ASLA, which is the American Society of Landscape Architects, Visionary Landscape National Competition. The proposal calls for saving abandoned farms as social memory boxes, containers of sacred relics. A new policy encourages counties to acquire and set aside one farm per 4 townships. Some are made safe and accessible rural pocket parks for surrounding farm families and distant urbanites. Sturdy bins and barns are retrofitted as picnic shelters and play spaces. Mesh wire corn beans and barns corn beans become aviaries and garden gazebos. Some structural vestiges and dead implements are framed, left to the mercy of the elements. Other farms are closed off as wild reserves, to replace the lost hedges and windbreaks and provide safe haven for wildlife and plants. Dispersed rural reliquaries are then connected with rural cemeteries and other public functions by pedestrian and bike prairie paths lined with abandoned farm-to-market gravel roads and railroad tracks. When exurbia finally advances to absorb these areas, rural reliquaries and prairie paths will continue to serve as potent memory boxes, communal parks and corridors for this new landscape. My approach to rural ruins applies to industrial ruins as well. These remnants of bygone industries and infrastructural facilities are fraught with dereliction and are ostracized. They await their fate. Often, they're razed to make room for a new development. At times, recognized for their economic potential and historic contents, they fall prey to gentry commodification, reproduced as industrial heritage museums and upscale lofts, such as in this complex, the Flour Mill Row in Minneapolis. Or they're becoming frozen in time museums, such as in Missouri Mines State Historic Site at the Old Lead Belt region. Now, both of these approaches, the museumized and the commodified, really overlook the true potential of these sites. When sensibly assigned new alternative and dynamic programs, such places can become a cultural material for novel recreation and aesthetic material for imagination. This is precisely what has evolved in Duisburg Steel Blast Factory in the Ruhr area of Germany, which was turned into a landscape park by landscape architect Latz and Partner. Now, these are just some images of Duisburg North Park, which I once characterized as the garden in the machine, borrowing and reversing Leo Marx's classical book title, The Machine in the Garden. Now, somewhere not far from these bygone noxious industries at the interface of city and countryside, the fate of other rejected grounds, our closed dumps, is being determined. This is where we arrive at dystopia, and the book I published a couple of years ago. And here lies the side of story number 3, The Allure of Dumps. Before I discuss my approach to the design of Closed Dump, I would like to read a passage from my book introduction. As I became a landscape architect and realized that people regard members of our profession as apostles of beauty, where beauty meant parks and gardens filled with trees, flowers, and lawn, and shaped in the image of benign and pretty nature, I grew restless. Not unlike artist Robert Smithson, I researched for the dialectics in the landscape and eventually found them in the extreme marginal landscapes, in garbage dumps and sewage plants. I considered these places to be rich with cultural significance and substance. They're landscapes of extremes and contradictions, at once dreadful and fascinating, attractive and repelling, looking for ways to protect the marginal waste places from a second destruction, from the thoughtless desires of planners and landscape architects to dismiss them as morbid, consider them a disturbance, and fix them into prescribed formulas of beauties. I set out to write this book. This book is therefore a critique of society and of my profession. Now, the book focuses on societal ideas about waste, practices of waste handling and their physical manifestations at the margin. It examines the complexities of these sites, reviews the efforts to sanitize the city and disguise waste sites, and proposes alternative designs to conventional disguised approaches. My aim is to unravel the contradictory, destructive, and constructive powers of these landscapes and to help us see their potential. You might ask, what is the allure of dumps? After all, garbage is something to either forget about or bitch about. Most people abhor and repress thoughts about garbage dumps, and even those that are attracted to them, too embarrassed by their own liking, hide their stories. Well, writers don't. Writer Wallace Stegner and Robert Sullivan are among the few who indulge in and convey their ventures into the grime of dumps. In his story, The Dump Ground, Stegner describes his Canadian local town dump as a source of knowledge where he could read the town's daily habits and history. He calls it the first institution of our forming Canadian civilization. And he writes, "The place fascinated us, and it should have, for this was the kitchen midden of all civilization we knew. It gave us the most tantalizing glimpses into our neighbors' lives and our own. It provided an aesthetic distance from which to see ourselves." Robert Sullivan shares Stegner's fascination with excursions into urban dumps. In the Meadowlands Adventures at the End of the City, Sullivan describes the marvels and uncanniness of New York's longtime dumping ground in northern New Jersey. And I quote, he writes, "I like to think of the Meadowland as an undesigned national park. There were flames everywhere, and it was like Yellowstone with geysers of steam and smoke. These once thriving swamps, just 5 miles west of Lower Manhattan on the other side of the Hudson River, have become a toxic slough, a receptacle of urban outcasts marked by human flaws, accidents, and greed." Armed with a shovel, Sullivan sets out to excavate the dumping ground, to solve some mysteries, and to rescue a buried fragment or two of New York's great neoclassical Pennsylvania station, which is buried there, and of London's World War II rubble for his private collection. He marvels at the thought that some mounds in Kearney Meadows are London hills. made of buildings that once stood in the British capital before being transported to the great American sink of the Meadowlands. Sullivan gropes for the fantastic and the eerie, but he also considers the negligence and exploitation that sucked the life out of the Meadowlands and which bred a deadly legacy, the toxic plague of 20th century industrial society. Along with poets, explorers, the lowly and mean-spirited, dumps have lured and nurtured other kinds of people and animals, speculators, dreams, revolutionaries, as well as normal folks who are attracted to their peculiar nature and offerings. Rural dumps are known as grounds for enacting both disposal and acquisition, places of both social and economic rituals. The Sunday afternoon excursion to drop off the family's garbage and perhaps pick up some gossip and a discarded item or two was a well-known ritual. Well-known games of rat shooting and forbidden love affairs also took place at the rural dumps. But the sanitary landfill, cleaner, regulated, and safer, put an end to these and other dump allures. It keeps its trophies out of reach. Now, I really came to talk to you about design. So, the prevailing agenda for closed landfill restoration, which I disagree with, is to return the site to its previous state and blend it well with its natural surrounding. This drawing by landscape architect firm Walker and Johnson for Countryside Landfill in Illinois demonstrates a typical proposal for reshaping the closed landfill at the end of its work life from a constructed engineered artifact into a benign rolling landscape. Now, such an agenda favors soft contour lines in order to disguise the buried content. So following the capping, the ground is seeded and the dump disappears under a green grass mantle. Conversely, my own conceptual proposal for the reclamation of Chiria, a notorious garbage dump near Tel Aviv in Israel, protects the dramatic silhouettes of the waste mound. This is a 200-foot high and 55-acre dump mound looking like a castle. It's prominently located nearby major freeways at the southeast entrance to Tel Aviv, in fact, not far from where I grew up. I remember watching the mound growing over the years, as well as a brief period in which an art project claimed the site. The artist simply attached to the face of the mountain the letters making up the word Hollywood. Now, the project, Chiria in the Museum, was part of an international exhibition at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art in the year 2000. 20 artists, architects, and landscape architects were invited to propose a design for the reclamation of this 40-year-old dump following its closure. My proposal, called Reclaiming Metaphors Out of the Dump, or 4 Gestures for Chiria, engages 4 dimensions of the site: ecological processes, cultural meanings, structural stability, and visual perception. To access the multiplicity inherent at the site, I built on 4 metaphors that shape the design: Mausoleum of Entropy, Museum of Rejects, Archive of Subconscious Depositories, and Monument of Unpleasant Necessities. The first gesture, or design intervention, probes the processes entombed inside the mound. It releases the captive processes of decomposition from the mausoleum of dead commodities. A buried energy facility collects and transforms methane gas into electricity, while a flare ignited by methane gas towers on top, exhausting the last breath of the mound and releasing them to the sky. 7 carved fountains at the foot of the mound spew the collected garbage juice called lichet into a series of constructed marshes, channeling the toxic liquid into green kidneys, which are bioengineered wetlands that cleanse the toxic liquids before discharging them into the Ayalon River. The wetlands are woven with walking paths to enable visitors to view the cleansing operation. As a museum of outcast material, Khiria is connected through a second gesture to other museums of art and culture, to which it is inversely related. People of the 7 cities whose garbage built the mountain are invited to extract a volume, a piece of the mound, encase it, and place it in front of their home museums. A visitor center and an on-site museum displays various cultural artifacts dug out of the dump. It adjoins an active waste transfer station and recycling center at the foot of the mound. As an archive of unconscious repositories, Khiria is connected via a third gesture to its deep layers of deposited histories and geological grounding. New archaeological and engineering drillings to study and stabilize the mountain join existing hydrological test drillings in the area. The emptied cylinders are filled with reinforced concrete to stabilize the mountains. On top, derricks of imaginative constructions serve as probes for spatial lightings and events. And finally, the built monuments of unpleasant necessities, which is the fourth gesture, draws connection and enhances high-level conversations between Khiria and other contemporary monuments in its urban surroundings. A skyline promenade equipped with giant telescopes direct walkers and joggers to view other monuments and garbage mounds in the surrounding area. Each of the designated monuments provides information about Khiria and redirects visitors' gaze back towards the mountain. Following the exhibition, which was intended to steer debate and harness support for the reclamation project, a detailed design competition was won by Peter Latz, the same designer of industrial ruin in Duisburg-Nord Park, which I highly appreciate. Much in the same spirit of my own proposal, Latz's design protects the mound silhouette, integrates a recycling and transfer station at the foot of the mountain, as well as mitigation measures to effectively collect toxic liquids and gases, and then enable human access to the top, where a hidden garden is nestled on a plateau and viewing pavilions offer views of surrounding cities to which it is indebted. The city is therefore our final destination is the site of the last 2 stories. Story number 4, pork barrels. So I'd like to turn now to a public art installation I did in 2003 in the East Village in downtown Des Moines, and to use it to launch a critique on the city. The work is titled Democracy Hypocrisy, though it was dubbed the pork barrels. The project was part of the storefront art project commissioned by the Iowa Arts Council to 10 winning Iowa designers and artists. It was intended to spur momentum to shed light on this changing neighborhood. 10 vacant storefronts were temporarily refurbished with artworks. My work was a commentary on the foreseeable urban gentrification process in the area and associated political clout. Now, in professional parlance, gentrification means the transformation of a run-down urban area into an upscale neighborhood with the familiar scene of art galleries, specialty stores, fashionable restaurants, loft apartments, and condominiums. In the process of cleaning the area of undesirables and increasing its tax base, the range of diverse stores, services, and population is decreased and replaced. Democracy hypocrisy alluded to the flattening effect of gentrification and also to the endangered democratic political activism so integral to a neighborhood that hosts the state capitol building and government offices. The two-sided storefront windows of Old Woolworth's department store on East Locust 504 was adorned with 9 columns of democracy, Corinthian columns echoing those of the Capitol's western portico. The columns were made of colored paper, white, pink, blue, and yellow, similar to the colors of the original bills that pass through the House and Senate every year and fill up thick folders in the State Capitol Law Library. The exact height of the last 5 years, paper yield was marked on the storefront window. Placed between the columns were 55-gallon steel barrel stuffed with hogs that gaze at the Capitol. Mirrors lining up the floor space reflected the barrels in the open floor. The controversial Senate File 165, Iowa English Language Affirmation Act, that was signed by the governor at the time was printed in 4 languages, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, and English, on a translucent paper that was hung from ceiling to floor at the back of the storefront window space. A narrow strip of mirrors corresponding to people's average eye level was hung in front of the wallpaper. 2 large quotes above the display window referred to the difficulty of sustaining a viable democracy. And finally, a pair of chairs similar to the visitors' chairs in the gallery of the House and Senate were placed on sidewalk in front of the window, inviting passers-by to take a seat, read about the legislation process, and watch a continuous video of an hour session in the House and the Senate. This was in 2003. Since then, much has changed in downtown, in Des Moines' 2 downtowns. And I would like to use the last few minutes to make a few observations of the current scene of our capital city and to voice a concern. Which brings me to the final story number 5, Urbanism Light, in which I would like to characterize the central city. There are 3 processes that seem to dominate central city, our central city today: historicism, suburbanization, and privatization and private control of public space. Now, all these 3 have particularly become apparent in the last 3 years in Des Moines, but these conditions are not particular to Des Moines. They exist in large cities all over the nation and beyond. Though regarded as essential measures to save downtowns, in fact, they undermine the productive cultural and socio-political potential of these historic cores. And I'd like to describe these new realities using several recent downtown developments: the East Village, Western Gateway, and Nolan Plaza. Historicized upper middle class development is mostly apparent in the East Village, including various beautification projects along the river and at the foot of the Capitol building. The new urban landscape is its forms and aesthetics are an edited version of an early 20th century city beautiful era. Upscale lofts and retail are accompanied by an esthicized streetscape oddly planted with flower beds. Following the city investments of about $11 million in streetscapes and developer incentives, the East Village is indeed a favorite gentry destination. Last summer, almost weekly headlines in the business section of the Des Moines Register recount new and forthcoming businesses, but they neglect to mention those that have disappeared. Among these are the Chinese grocery store, a hardware and army surplus store, and 2 gay bars. And with that, the mix of residents and clientele changed. Older businesses that have remained are endangered species targeted for acquisition by a handful of developers. Until recently, they were also threatened by the eminent domain law, a U.S. Supreme Court granted power ludicrously applied to boost the city tax base, which indeed has risen the area by 50 to 70%. Now, that law also has its drawbacks, and last July, with the help of property rights and advocates, a Des Moines business owner, Brad Hamilton, who owns T-shirt printing business and a record shop on East Locust, and whom city leaders failed to force to sell out, managed to convince the Iowa House and Senate to override the law. He's still there, but he's quite worried that he might need to sell out. Thomas Bender, a professor of humanities, best characterized the current debate over the nature of revitalized historic city centers in these words. It seems as if our best middle-class vision of the city today is that of an entertainment zone, a place to visit, a place to shop. It is more than a lived-in theme park. This amounts to what he called urbanism light. The new urban recipe is insidious, for it pretends to offer what it is not. Such pseudo-city culture offers scenes of city life, not the city itself. The city light is safe, orderly, simplified. Second urban observation and critique pertains to the suburbanization of downtown. This is realized through the introduction of spacious corporate campuses and large open spaces and parks into the downtown core. So, as suburbia densifies, the center decompresses, de-densifies, thus blurring distinctions between core and periphery, urban and suburban. This can best be seen along the river, but also in the Western Gateway area. And so the Western Gateway area is, in fact, a case in point. In the early 1990s, when the New York architecture firm of Agrest and the Gonzalez conceived of the Des Moines Vision Plan and recommended the area for an urban renewal project, they wanted to undo decades of neglect of the historic Auto Row. They've envisioned a central park on a stretch of 5 blocks area. The park between 10th and 15th Streets and Grand and Locust was envisioned as, I quote, a heart of a new mixed-use district and a gateway to downtown Des Moines, end quote. This concept was modeled primarily after New York Central Park. And the thinking goes, if it's good for New York, it surely is good for Des Moines. But is an idea of a park that is predicated on a 150-year-old model appropriate for a 21st century city? Central City was designed by landscape architects Calvert Vore and Frederick Law Olmsted in the 1860s. Now, if the early model was appropriately conceived as a rural escape from the ills of the mid-19th century industrialized city, as well as a strategy to spur development in the still vacant and derelict northern Manhattan, the current rhetoric of a Central Park and Green Heart in the midst of the city of Des Moines seems pointless. What does a 21st century Des Moines, where almost everyone lives in the suburb with plenty of greenery, have in common with the congested and unsanitized 19th century New York? The answer has to do more with the high-end marketable real estate strategy that has sanctioned a countrified suburban office park image. And although Central Park at the time was in part a real estate booster, it also managed to fulfill other social needs: a much-needed open space and urban health. Conversely, Western Gateway Park in Des Moines seems to undermine its proclaimed agenda to recreate a viable and vital downtown, a place that needs to live and to be entertained after 5:30 p.m. and on weekends. Despite the park's diverse stated program, it offers mere passive visual comfort and has little new to propose to a city that aspires to invigorate urban public life. The 19th century park image, a naturalistic style emulating ponds, trees, tree groves, and hills, has simply been replaced here by the familiar suburban style park, genteel, sentimental, and passive, with open sweeping lawns and stylized water features, populated mostly during programmed public events. Few young people or families with children are able to afford to live around this village green. The new public library, designed by internationally acclaimed architect David Chipperfield, has helped to fix the suburban image and corporate image scheme in the midst of the city. Finally, the third process, being most evident in the downtown, is increased privatization and private control of public space and decrease of public action. This is most noticeable in recent happenings and a brewing debate over the future of Nolan Plaza, which is my final lecture destination. Nolan Plaza, a small but significant public place at the heart of the city, is considered for renovation. A group headed by the Downtown Business Alliance, the same group that is largely responsible for the character of the Western Gateway Park area, now advocates transforming the plaza into another green park. Nolan Plaza is not only the most strategically located public square in downtown, but it's also the only paved plaza in the city. This popular rhetoric of going green seems at odds with this sole expression of the city. The tight grip of corporate control over the plaza was made even more transparent recently when in June a group called Food Not Bombs, which feeds the homeless on Saturdays, was chased away. The police was acting on behalf of the Civic Center and the business around, who likely considered the people involved in the picnic as an eyesore. Following a sharp criticism, including the Register editorial, suggesting unlawful discrimination against certain citizens, the police has backed down from their threats to bar the group's activity. Now, for those who would like to see green lawn mantle over the plaza, I say, urban public life takes place on sidewalks and in squares, not on lawns and park paths. Despite the cold weather and the relatively limited time that outdoor space is used in Iowa, alternative places that encourage spontaneous happenings and exchange between people of all kinds, not just families and children, should be an integral part of a downtown scheme. This is also the case with our northern neighbor, downtown Minneapolis, where hard surface plazas serve as theaters and settings for gatherings, and green parks are kept at the periphery of the city. Nolan Plaza needs renovation, but must remain a paved urban plaza and not turned into a cute neighborhood park. The new plaza should accommodate additional outdoor cafes, possibilities for food vendors, fun, and public display and exchange. Urbanist Andreas Brookman writes, "We reach the point where being in public is identified with potential illegality on the one hand and the danger of personal harm on the other." I spend much time in the city of Tel Aviv, the city of Rome, and now the city of Los Angeles. Three very different models of urban poise, and I admit I'm one of those people that still cling to the idea of a lively downtown. But equally, I have faith in the coming of age of suburbia and its increasing productive role in the contemporary metropolis. By the end of this decade, half the world population are going to live in megacities made of fragmented zones, independent enclaves. Our ways of life and our cities have changed dramatically with digital technology and global economy. Spontaneous social interaction, that is public life, finds new territories outside city centers, within and between urban enclaves that made up today's contemporary city. Identifying and making projections for these emerging social patterns and physical patterns and expressions in the fragmented metropolis, and especially in the ambiguous zones, these zones along and under freeways, in abandoned warehouses, parking lots, and post-industrial zones, will likely be the topic of my doctoral dissertation. Critical landscape thinking will continue to be the mode of my investigation and of practice. Thank you very much.
No. I think Professor Engler would be happy to take questions up here afterwards if you'd like, and there's refreshments in back. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. Yes.